Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Venezuela may be happening in the capital markets, but an entire telenovela has been happening in crypto markets this year. Time now to turn to Simon Dixon of BnkToTheFuture.com to talk about ongoing drama in the crypto novella market. Simon Dixon, welcome back to the Keiser Report.
Great to be back.
All righty, so we have so much to cover. There's been so much going on in crypto. But first, let's just mention that Dotcom, the celebrated Dotcom, has announced BitCache. He'll be raising money on your platform, Bank to the Future. Tell us about it.
Yeah, so Dotcom is going back. He's coming back, and he's launching his second version of Mega Upload, which is encrypted file storage. And he's looking at attaching those transactions to Bitcoin payments now, potentially bringing hundreds of thousands. Well, there was apparently 100 million users in the first Mega Upload. So it'll be bringing lots and lots of new people to the Bitcoin market. And he's raising finance for his solution to scale the number of Bitcoin transactions that can happen every second.
And this all started with a 3 a.m. message on the internet between me, you, and him.
Yeah, we got the Twitter direct message from Dotcom, and you've been working with Kim for a while, so.
Yeah, but there's another drama on that layer too. But BitCache itself was a response to a storyline within this crypto novella, and that's the block size. It's quite a racy story, and it involves many big players and drama, a lot of drama. This was the highest drama, most weeping, people threatening, all sorts of horrible stuff if their block size answer wasn't met. So tell us about that block size debate that's been happening over the past few months. We haven't really covered it here, but has it resolved? Has that storyline resolved? And there's several different solutions from the outside, including BitCache, and then there are some more technical sort of crypto responses. So tell us about the block size debate.
Yeah, so one of the most heated debates was that Bitcoin couldn't scale beyond a certain size. The people that know what they were talking about said that you can only do about 7 transactions per second or so. In order to scale it to the next stage, we need to start implementing changes. On the side, we got this experiment, and many people were calling for what's called a fork. And a fork is where you create another version of the code, and the miners that are verifying that code, can decide which one they want, and the one that's most popular becomes Bitcoin. So people were calling for that hard fork, but the developers were being very conservative and saying that there's massive, massive consequences to doing that, and something we don't want to risk, because we now have this, at the time was about a $12-14 billion market cap in Bitcoin. And so what we did is on the side, they implemented some changes that allow it to scale in a very conservative way. Private companies like Blockstream started developing things called the Lightning Network, which is a piece of technology that sits on top of Bitcoin that allows it to scale.
So this would be a competitor to BitCache as well? This
sort of. Well, what Blockstream are doing is they're actually building technology that sits on the actual protocol level, whereas BitCache is a private company that's implementing a specific solution that kind of centralizes transactions but uses the protocol to get the benefits of both worlds.
So right now, transactions that could happen on Bitcoin, on the blockchain, was 7 per second, compared to, say, roughly what Visa or MasterCard is. How much would that be? Hundreds of thousands per second? Yeah, okay.
Yeah, well, you talk about the hard fork and the consequences. We kind of had a case study, right, with the Ethereum story. What can happen with Ethereum and then Ethereum Classic.
So let's set up the background to that story, because that was, again, Max and I were traveling across the U.S. and there was remarkable, again, it fits with the crypto novella thing, huge crimes. Huge crimes always happen on Coronation Street or EastEnders or any of these sort of, British telenovelas. So the huge crimes were massive robberies, you could call them. One for BitFinex, which was a Hong Kong-based company. We'll come to that second. But as Max brought up Ethereum is a currency, a blockchain, and Ether is their currency. And then there's the DAO, which is a smart contract that wasn't smart enough to avoid being 52 million siphoned from there. 70 million from BitFinex. But start off with the first robbery, which was from the DAO.
Yeah, so probably some jargon busting to do first.
Yeah.
So a smart contract is simply, it's built upon a principle that the founders of Ethereum and others before that came up with, which is that code is law. And so what they tried to do is implement contracts where there's the outcomes of those contracts can be enforced by code rather than law. So if me and you have a bet and there's a specific outcome, then you could say the money goes to you if you're right and the money goes to me if you're wrong. And there's no counterparty there, there's no third party in order to arbitrate that process.
There's no pleading to a judge to accept your side of the story. It's the code is the law.
Exactly. So Ethereum came along and said, we've got a new paradigm for the world. We've got a new blockchain. We're going to use the principles of Bitcoin. We're going to solve all the problems with Bitcoin. And we're going to implement this smart contract system called the code is law. They successfully created the second blockchain that reached $1 billion a market cap.
That was that was for Ethereum.
For Ethereum.
Yeah.
And they successfully got miners behind it to a point where it was a fairly secure blockchain. Not as secure as Bitcoin, but a fairly secure one, where others had failed. And then the first application came along, which actually was a bit controversial because the foundation behind Ethereum, who were meant to be in charge of the code, started forking off to their own projects and building companies. One of them was a company called Slockit, which was trying to create a smart contract of the Uber model. And then rather than raising finance for Slockit, the team created this incredibly complex structure that was called the DAO.
DAO, so Decentralized Autonomous Organization.
Yeah, not to confuse with the Dow Jones, the DAO.
Or the DAO.
the DAO. And this essentially was like a VC fund whereby all of the people that contributed to this smart contract were actually the equivalent of the shareholders, and they vote on how the money's spent. And it was not clear how, they were raising finance for that company, but then they created this DAO, and I think a lot of the money was going to go to that company.
So it's like a venture capital firm, but they raised 150 million?
Well, it was way more successful than anyone ever imagined.
Everybody expected like 1 or 2 million.
It became like an IPO,
Yeah.
$150 million worth of this Ether token.
And the notion was that it was supposed to be the wisdom of the crowd knew better than many VC funds are in San Francisco or Silicon Valley, and these one guy knows what's a good bet or not.
That was a theory. And then also the very important theory was that the code is law.
Yes.
So
okay.
the code is law means that whatever was written into that smart contract was law. And so a hacker, whatever you want to call them, saw a flaw in the code of this DAO that allowed them to drain approximately...
You call it a flaw, he would maybe, or she, or they might have called it, well, that was a brilliantly written contract for me to make a lot of money.
Well, exactly, and so they drained $60 million worth of these smart contracts out of the DAO. And then suddenly we started to get this user case of, can we really test that code is law?
But the way the
concept.
DAO was set up as well is like you couldn't just withdraw it overnight like you could say if you hacked Mt. Gox. It takes 30 days before you could actually get or 28 days before you could actually take the convert it.
The hacker came out and said, I will legally enforce if you try and take my contracts that I legally got hold of. And the Ethereum Foundation started to realize this might be some kind of systemic risk in our blockchain. And they took a side because, allegedly many people say that a lot of the Ethereum Foundation investors were also the big investors in the DAO.
So when you say that, that's like the equivalent of the Bitcoin Foundation or the biggest Bitcoin holders deciding, for example, Mt. Gox, which is not part of them, but used Bitcoin, and people had $700 million worth of Bitcoin essentially stolen, and that they would have rescued it, like hard fork there to make those. So that's the equivalent of what happened.
Absolutely, and what it did highlight is that some of the principles that made Bitcoin work, i.e. there is no founder and no one knows who Satoshi Nakamoto is, meant that when large-scale theft happened, like Mt. Gox, no one could go to Satoshi Nakamoto and say, please reverse the chain. But Ethereum was the people that created it were known, So everybody demanded of these people, I want my money back.
Vitalik Buterin, right?
Yep, so Vitalik, everyone went to Vitalik and the foundation members and said, we demand our money back. Please, can you fork, reverse the chain, do something to get this 60 million and implement something that says the code is not law.
Yeah, well, I mean, this is then fantastic highlights why Satoshi Nakamoto being anonymous was a genius move, because you can't go retroactively and rewrite history, as it were, number one. Number two, the fact they'd opened up now 2 chains in the Ethereum. You got the Ethereum Classic and this new Ethereum, the new Ethereum. And so now these two are competing with each other, and you've got...
Ethereum Classic is actually the old one, which became the new one.
Right, it's the old one.
It's like these characters who die on a telenovela and then come back.
So Ethereum Classic is the code is law. That was their principle, which was the original chain. And then the second chain, Ether, is this one where they reversed and it wasn't immutable. And under extreme circumstance, you can break the contract.
Right. So the thought when it broke, when it hard forked, was that, well, the classic will just kind of die off because this is now the new one is the main chain. But that hasn't happened, right? No,
I mean, it didn't have a name. They were the Ethereum Foundation was celebrating a successful fork. And they were getting ready for the next phase of Ethereum after this success. And then suddenly this bogey called Ethereum Classic came along, which was created by one of the exchanges, essentially finding some kind of way of issuing all of the investors a new coin. Everybody got their DAO money back. Ether came back, they exchanged it for Ethers, and then this new token came along and everyone doubled up their money. And suddenly all the investors were compensated in a way. But you had this complete split in the community between the code is law and the chain where the code is not law.
All right, well, we're going to have to continue this a little bit because it's a very involved story, interesting story in the crypto world.
Of course, all telenovelas need a second part, so you got to come back.
You need a cliffhanger.
This is a cliffhanger.
That's a cliffhanger. We'll pick this up in due time. But that's going to do it for this episode of the Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Sacey Herbert. I'd like to thank our guest, Simon Dixon of BnkToTheFuture.com. If you'd like to get in touch, tweet us at Keiser Report. Until next time, bye, y'all.